He's also making it harder for 24 million people to keep coverage year to year by revoking automatic re-enrollment in affordable health care plans. The Affordable Care Act is the law of the land, whether the president likes it or not, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services must follow the law, because guess what? The American people like this law. With healthcare, access, costs, and the like. So we need someone at the HHS who is actually going to take this down. Whether it is the denial of care of way too many patients under insurance policies, or whether it is the expense of these prescription drugs, where still more work needs to be done on patents and some of the reforms on a bipartisan basis that we've gotten out of judiciary, but we need an HHS answer the question if he was going to keep negotiating. None of this that he has talked about in these hearings, from my perspective, whether it is a rubber stamp for withdrawing the United States from the World Health Organization, whether it is upending the work of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, whether it is what I've just spoken about tonight about not believing in vaccines or in not carrying on the work of negotiating prescription drugs. None of this will bring down healthcare costs. None of this will make Americans healthier. President Eisenhower, who established the agency that is now HHS, President Eisenhower, trusted Republican president, said in his 1954 State of the Union address that the department symbolized the government's permanent concern with the human problems of our citizens. The person at the helm of this department must, above all, share that concern that President Eisenhower put out there so clearly. He must prioritize the well-being of his fellow Americans, must be guided by facts and science, not politics or personal opinions. That's why 17,000 doctors have sounded the alarm about Mr. Kennedy's nomination. It's why more than 700 public health experts called his nomination dangerous. And it's why, for the first time in living memory, more than 70 Nobel Prize winners across the fields of medicine, chemistry, physics, and economics came together in public opposition to this cabinet pick. Mr. President, I believe in listening to experts. I trust doctors. I trust public health researchers. I trust Nobel Prize winners. That is why, on behalf of every senior who relies on medications to live and age with dignity, every child who deserves the promise of a future free from preventable diseases, and every American whose health and safety depend on sound scientific guidance, I will be voting no on his nomination, and I urge my colleagues to do what they know is the right thing and vote no as well. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota. Wisconsin, sorry.
Mr. President, I rise today in opposition to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to lead the Department of Health and Human Services. Healthcare is not just a policy to me. It is deeply personal. I got into public service because of my own healthcare journey. When I was 9, I was hospitalized with a serious childhood illness. It was similar to spinal meningitis. That wasn't the exact diagnosis, but similar. While I fought to survive and then ultimately to get better and fully recover, my grandparents who raised me, they struggled to figure out how to pay for the life-saving care that I needed and received. In total, I spent 3 months in the hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. When I talk about health care, I don't just speak as a United States Senator or as a Wisconsinite. I'm speaking as a person who knows what it was like to spend months in a hospital bed. I'm speaking as someone who knows the emotional toll and the financial stress that it put on my loved ones. I'm speaking as someone who knows firsthand how important it is to protect our children from serious illness and the dire consequences when our children do get sick. And that is why I was so disturbed by Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to lead our nation's largest public health agency. As a member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, I was able to question Mr. Kennedy at one of his nomination hearings. I watched as he over and over again parroted the same answer when pressed about his anti-vaccine views. "Show me the data," he would say. When asked if he still believes that vaccines cause autism, he would not commit. He again said, "Show me the data." Well, Mr. Kennedy has had every opportunity to review the overwhelming consensus of doctors, researchers, and experts that vaccines are safe and effective. He certainly had the opportunity to do so not just before his confirmation hearing, but before spending a decade peddling misinformation and conspiracy theories about vaccines. Apparently, he didn't look at the research before traveling to Samoa to rail against the measles vaccine. Perhaps if he had, the 83 people, primarily infants and children, who died from a subsequent outbreak of measles would still be with us. I think it's clear that he also didn't bother to review the research before spreading misinformation online. With one study finding that among verified Twitter accounts, Mr. Kennedy was by far the top purveyor of vaccine misinformation, garnering more than 3 times as much engagement as the second most retweeted account. Now, we're supposed to believe that if we simply show Mr. Kennedy the research, he'll change his tune. Well, I believe someone applying to be the top health official in this country shouldn't have to be convinced to follow the science. We shouldn't have to hold their feet to the fire on whether they would be willing to protect our children from polio or measles. They should already be an expert in the field, not an expert at evading responsibility and spreading conspiracy theories. Americans deserve a leading health official who believes in science, not in conspiracies. If Mr. Kennedy is not willing to believe or even review the overwhelming data on vaccines before spreading dangerous lies about their safety, then I highly doubt that he will change his tune when leading the Department of Health and Human Services. And it's not just his statements like, "No vaccine is safe and effective." And by the way, he really did make that statement. I've seen it on a podcast. But he's repeatedly made claims with no evidence. He said Wi-Fi causes cancer. He said antidepressants cause school shootings. He questioned whether HIV does in fact cause AIDS. And time and again, he is showing us who he is. By his own admission, he is not interested in the research. He has no time for the data. And these claims may seem outlandish, they may seem harmless, but they all point to a truth about Mr. Kennedy. He not only does not believe the science, but he's willing to actively undermine it. He spreads dangerous conspiracy theories, and he puts families' health and safety at risk. RFK Jr. will put Americans in harm's way. Kids will be at risk of getting preventable diseases like measles and mumps. Women will have essential health care ripped away. Families will be further away, not closer, to having cures to diseases like cancer. And sadly, the list goes on and on. So I urge my colleagues, especially those who understand how dangerous vaccine skepticism is, to ask themselves a simple question. Will this nominee keep your constituents safe, or will he harm them? For Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the answer is clear. I oppose this nomination on behalf of Wisconsin families and encourage my colleagues to vote no. I yield the floor.
Researchers, scientists, and caregivers are the most dedicated people I know. Every day, they give their lives to heal and save others. They deserve a knowledgeable leader who is committed to evidence and excellence. They deserve a secretary committed to advancing cutting-edge medicine to save lives, not rejecting the advances we have already made. They deserve a stable, moral, and ethical person at the helm of this crucial agency. They deserve better than Bobby Kennedy, and so do the rest of us. I urge the Senate to reject his nomination. Sincerely, Carolyn Kennedy. That's a hard letter for her to have written, a hard letter for me to have read, but from a person who's known him all his life, who admires his capacity ultimately to kick the heroin addiction that he had, has expressed very clearly questions about his character. Now, why is that important? You need a steady hand to run a major agency with the awesome responsibility of the healthcare well-being of the people of this country. It is a hard thing to do. It's very stressful. And that history that was recounted by Carolyn Kennedy certainly raises major questions about the suitability of Mr. Kennedy to assume the responsibility of Health and Human Services Secretary. The second question is competence. Competence has to do with what your experience is, what your training is, what your managerial capacities are. You know, what Mr. Kennedy said is he wants to be a disruptor in the healthcare system. I'm in favor of a disruptor. We need change. I don't want a destroyer. And Robert Kennedy does not have the temperament or the capacity or the competence to be merely a disruptor and a builder, but to be a destroyer. Competence, the obvious things: he's not a doctor, he's not a scientist, he's not a public health expert, or someone who's led a complex organization like HHS or a private major organization that requires extraordinary managerial skills. He's built a career. We have a debate about this, but I come down clearly on the side that his career is built on misinformation. And it's misinformation in healthcare. And by the way, one of the things that's so tough, if you're a mother, you're a father, and you have a partner, you have a son or daughter who's really seriously sick, you'll do anything. You'll mortgage your house. You'll liquidate your retirement account. You'll do anything and everything you can for the well-being of that child or that loved one. You'll do it. But also, if you have a person you love who's diagnosed with a fatal illness, you also are really vulnerable to folks who tell you there's an easy way out, a magic therapy, a special doctor in South America. You're so hungry to get the cure, to get the answer, to protect the person you love. Anybody in the medical profession should take great care not to abuse the trust they have. My view, Robert Kennedy has spent his considerable talent promoting misinformation to vulnerable people who have motives we all have, and that is the well-being of people we love. Some of the things that Mr. Kennedy said when he's attacking vaccines, they're not based at all on science, but they appeal to people's distrust of the standard medical profession. Kennedy made anti-Semitic remarks about COVID-19, saying that the pandemic was ethnically targeted to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people. I mean, what is that about? His anti-vax work in Samoa contributed to a measles outbreak in 2019, and 83 people, mostly children, died. Kennedy falsely claimed 5G internet causes radiation sickness and DNA damage. Some people believe this. They saw it on the internet. He's promoting it using the magic of the Kennedy name, the credibility that comes from being a member of one of the most storied political families in the history of our country. Kennedy doesn't understand that HIV/AIDS are and have, and he doesn't understand what HIV/AIDS are, and has espoused homophobic and racist views on both HIV/AIDS. He has said, quote, "It's undeniable that African AIDS is an entirely different disease from Western AIDS," unquote. Kennedy has also pushed a false theory that AIDS is really chronic fatigue syndrome. And Kennedy said it's antidepressants, not guns, that lead to more mass shootings. And it said Big Pharma's influence over the NIH stopped them from researching mass shootings. When I think about how did he come to be the nominee, it's relevant because it obviously isn't on the basis of his scientific knowledge, his skill at running a major organization, healthcare research that he's done. It was political. He ran for president in the Democratic primary. He lost badly, made no progress, selected his vice presidential candidate on the basis of her capacity to write checks and keep the campaign going. It blew up nevertheless, and he went hand in hand to candidate Trump, who was leading by far on the Republican side, pretty much uncontested, and begged for a job. And in exchange for Kennedy's political support, President Trump, then candidate Trump, told Kennedy, "You could be HHS secretary," and here he is. So that's hardly the resume to inspire confidence that he'll be good at the job. He was good at ingratiating himself to President Trump, but that's not confidence for me that he'll be good at securing the health and well-being of this country. And interestingly enough, one of the things that President Trump did in his first term that I have great respect for is Operation Warp Speed. We were in COVID. A lot of things President Trump did I think were bad, but I'm going to talk about something he did that was really good. We needed a vaccine. We all remember back then, we knew COVID was deadly. We were all terrified that somebody or a family member, a friend, would contract the virus. We didn't know how it was spreading. There was even time when if you got your groceries, you were supposed to leave your bag outside. We just didn't know. We were trying to figure it out. But what we did all know is that what would give us security and safety was a vaccine. And we didn't have one. And Operation Warp Speed was a commitment by the federal government to put up money in advance to help facilitate research and put up money in advance to build production capacity for a yet-to-be determined, a yet-to-be invented vaccine. So what happened with Operation Warp Speed was the combination of federal money going into pharmaceutical companies who devoted their scientific expertise, medical expertise, to finding a vaccine, and they found it. And then when they found it, we didn't start building the manufacturing capacity, we had it in place. And that was a risk because we didn't know we'd get the vaccine. We didn't know if it would work or it wouldn't. But the Trump administration made a commitment to be ready the moment that vaccine was found. And as a result of that, we were able to get the vaccines out to millions of people way before, in the absence of Operation Warp Speed, it would have been delivered. That's an achievement. Robert Kennedy, 6 months after the vaccine was out and lives were being saved, hundreds of thousands of lives were being saved, said it was a disaster. He condemned it. So how is it, even in the face of this almost miraculous discovery and creation and then delivery of this vaccine, and hundreds of thousands of lives saved, and a restoration of some sense of security, even though we had a long way to go, that Mr. Kennedy condemned the scientific breakthrough that led to the savings of lives of people in your state, Madam President, and in mine. So it just bewilders me that a person who is so rash and who so rejects not only science, but life experience in this country, where Operation Warp Speed helped us get that vaccine created and distributed. That's pretty strange. You know, other things that Mr. Kennedy has said about vaccines, and this really is serious, because we're having debates about these things and people don't have confidence. The more we undercut their confidence about vaccines, will they get vaccinated for polio? Will they get vaccinated for measles? Will they get vaccinated for COVID? The more you undercut that with specious claims, the more resistance there is for us having the confidence we need as a society to make a decision about how to proceed. But Robert Kennedy, some of the things he did, he falsely claimed that vaccines cause autism. He falsely claims that vaccines cause autoimmune diseases, develop disorders and allergies. He supports leave that out because people can disagree on that, but he claimed vaccines can cause rare childhood cancers, claimed that the Spanish flu came from vaccine research, no evidence in the world for that, called COVID shots a crime against humanity, claimed the COVID vaccine was a conspiracy against black communities, raised a lot of money off anti-vaccine propaganda films, went to Samoa, as others have said, to amplify anti-vaccine voices and contributed to a measles outbreak, and that measles outbreak killed 83 people. And as my colleague from Georgia mentioned, he compared COVID policies with Nazi testing programs, compared vaccination requirements to Nazi experimentation. claim pesticides make people trans. Claimed HIV does not cause AIDS. You know, and a couple of things that he claimed fluoride causes diseases. Claimed that 5G internet causes radiation sickness and DNA damage. That's not the person I think that we can trust to build up science, build up the credibility of good science, make decisions about allocation of research. It's just a person, I don't know how to describe that. It's just a conspiracy-minded person who comes up with the conspiracy of the day to challenge anything that's out there that will advance his interest. You know, the other issue are the priorities. And this is where, on how best to improve our healthcare system, there's going to be a debate, and there always is, within the Democratic caucus, oftentimes within the Republican conference, and certainly across the aisle. I was a strong supporter of Obamacare. And my Republican colleagues in the House at that time were united in their opposition. It passed, really with the vote of Senator McCain here. And the debate never ended. When I was in the House after Obamacare was passed and the Republicans took the majority, it seemed like every vote was about repealing the health care bill. But finally, that's behind us. It's been accepted. But it's not necessarily guaranteed. And in fact, we have to make a lot of improvement. But the priorities that I'm hearing from the Trump administration, which would be carried out by the Health and Human Services Secretary, are very disturbing to me and would be very, very harmful to Vermont. Dramatic cuts in the Medicaid budget. Medicaid helps low-income kids. It really is also the lifeline for our seniors who need nursing home care. You know, Medicaid in Vermont, 194,000 or 30% of Vermonters could potentially be impacted by the administration cuts to Medicaid and health insurance tax credits and assistance. And that's all kinds of Vermonters. It's 20,000 seniors. It's 67,000 children. It's 19,000 Vermonters who have disabilities. And by the way, we have real affordability challenges in Vermont. And one of our big affordability challenges, we have very high property taxes and one of the highest income taxes in the country. But the property taxes are brutal on local property owners and homeowners. If those cuts occurred, as is being proposed by the Trump administration, and that would be advocated by Mr. Kennedy, that's a $113 million hole in the Vermont state budget. What do? You know, does the state go to local property taxpayers to try to make up the difference? Not possible, not sustainable. You know, 3 proposals would dramatically reduce federal funding for Medicaid, block grants, per capita caps, and reducing Medicaid matching rates. All of that has immediate and detrimental impact on our budget. Currently, the federal government pays between 50% and 77% of a Medicaid cost and more for certain high-value services. The administration proposals to slash billions in federal funding for Medicaid, as I mentioned, would really strain our budgets. The programs we have that would really be affected include Dr. Dinosaur. It provides low-cost or free health care for Vermont's children and teenagers under the age of 19. It also provides health care for pregnant women, which is so tremendous. Women who are pregnant getting health care and then after the baby is delivered, care then, that is such a critical time in their life and in the child's life. We want to keep that, not diminish it. Vermont Medicaid has a prescription cost assistance program that helps uninsured and those enrolled in Medicare with help on their drug costs. It's long-term care services for seniors. We want to keep these, and we want to improve it. If there's ways that we can make it more affordable, we want to do that. But we certainly don't want to blow it up. Vermonters could lose access to substance use treatment or mental health care. And our rural hospitals in Vermont are like rural hospitals in Alabama. They're a lifeline for our communities. They play a very important role in the well-being of communities, not just community health, but the local economies. They're under enormous pressure. Doctors there are not being paid what they need to be paid. They do an incredibly good job for folks, but they're really in jeopardy. And I'm working with Senator Bozeman and others to try to get the reimbursement rates for our community hospitals up to where they can be sustainable. The Kennedy plan would cut that and hurt us. So the bottom line here for me on the question of any nominee is a character, competence, and priorities. And on all three of these, I come up short with respect to Mr. Kennedy. Aside from the fact that we could do better, it's hard in many ways to see how we could do worse. So I would urge all of my colleagues to consider the consequences of their vote, a vote that would put a person of questionable character, a person of questionable competence, and a person of, in my view, bad priorities at the head of our healthcare system. So I would urge my colleagues to vote no. Madam President, I yield back.
Madam President.
The Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to start by commending my colleague, the Senator from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for his strong argument as to why we should all vote no on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. And I come to the floor tonight to voice my strong opposition to this nomination. You know, Mr. Kennedy says that he'll always follow the evidence, no matter where it leads. Well, if you look at his record, he hasn't done that. But, Madam President, let's apply that guidance and see where it leads when it comes to his own nomination. First, is he qualified to do the job? That should be the basic threshold question for any nominee to a position such as this. And the short answer is no. But let's now look at the evidence and understand why. We know that the Department of Health and Human Services manages some of our most critical health programs, like Medicare, like Medicaid. It does health research that delivers treatments and cures at the National Institutes of Health and the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. At the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, it determines whether or not the drugs we consume are safe and whether they're efficacious, whether they will actually do what the manufacturers say they will do. At the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, they disseminate information about pandemics and health risks, and they monitor the risk of outbreaks of disease around the world, especially those diseases that can travel across boundaries and hit the United States. It helps treat our nation's substance use crisis at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, known as SAMHSA. It ensures patient safety in our healthcare systems at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And it runs life-saving programs like the community health centers, Healthy Start, and the HIV/AIDS care at the Health Resources and Services Administration. It does all that and more. HHS also provides quality control for reproductive health services. It ensures that contraceptions are covered under the Affordable Care Act, and it makes sure that Americans can have access to over-the-counter options. HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, also includes early childhood development programs like Head Start and child care, programs to help the elderly age in their communities, and individuals with disabilities live independently. But Madam President, when you look at that wide range of important subjects that HHS covers, Mr. Kennedy has no experience, no qualifications in the vast majority of that work. Now, I don't think any of us expect that one Secretary of HHS can know everything. But if you monitored the hearings and listened to Mr. Kennedy's answers, you can see that Mr. Kennedy knows virtually nothing about all those important subjects. In fact, he was stunningly unprepared to discuss even the most basic programs at his confirmation hearing. Madam President, most of us, even those of us who are not on Medicare, have some understanding of the program. From our parents or grandparents, we have a sense of the basic components of Medicare. Medicare, of course, provides health care coverage to 68 million Americans, seniors and people with disabilities. But when Senator Hassan of New Hampshire questioned Mr. Kennedy about those basics, he pretty much got everything wrong. He could not explain the simple components of Medicare, like what covers hospital care and what covers doctor visits. These are not gotcha questions. These are not tough questions. These are questions that anybody who wants to be Secretary of HHS should understand, because Medicare is one of the biggest and most consequential programs within the jurisdiction of that department. Knowing the basics, just the basics, should be easy. So he didn't understand the basics of Medicare. How about Medicaid? Medicaid is another very important health program in our country. It covers nearly 80 million of our fellow Americans, including 37 million children. In my state of Maryland, Medicaid covers 20% of our residents, children and families, nursing home residents, pregnant women, and people with disabilities. At his confirmation hearing, RFK Jr. complained about Medicaid's, quote, high premiums and high deductibles, unquote. Even though, as we know, the majority of enrollees in Medicaid don't have any premiums. Medicaid doesn't have high premiums, but what it does have is very high approval ratings. Mr. Kennedy also erroneously said that the federal government covers the full cost when we know that it has been a shared responsibility between the federal government and the states. In fact, that's been the matter of subject of lots of debates in the United States Congress and at the Supreme Court. He didn't know that. So what we see in RFK Jr. is a demonstration over and over and over again, even when our Republican colleagues on the Senate Committee for Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions tried to coach him along, he still simply did not get it, did not get the basics. Now, perhaps some of our Republican colleagues, some of them, don't care so much about his lack of understanding of Medicaid. I've seen a lot of reports in the last couple weeks that House Republicans are planning to make deep cuts to Medicaid as part of a plan to cut taxes for the very, very rich and ask other Americans to pay for them, including Americans on Medicaid. So maybe for some, the fact that Mr. Kennedy's ignorant about Medicaid just doesn't get in the way. You know, Madam President, we're debating a budget reconciliation bill here in the United States Senate. I serve on the Budget Committee, and today in the Budget Committee, I offered a very simple proposal. I said that as part of this budget reconciliation process, the Senate should not consider, in fact, they made it a point of order, subject to point of order if we did consider, should not consider cuts to Medicare or Medicaid. Simple amendment. Let's lay down some guardrails before we debate this reconciliation bill. Unfortunately, not a single one of my Republican colleagues voted for that bill to make sure that we protect Medicare and Medicaid as we go through this reconciliation process. All of my Democratic colleagues voted for it. Now, it's bad enough that Mr. Kennedy is not qualified for this position. And clearly he's not qualified. But it's worse than that. I mean, there are lots of unqualified people that we might just pick out randomly, nominate that person to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and we could just have an unqualified person there. But with Mr. Kennedy, it's worse than that. He's not only unqualified, putting him in that position will put the public health of Americans at risk. And so that takes this to a whole different and more dangerous level. And we've heard a lot about this vaccine question, but it really does go to the heart of why he poses a threat to the public health. Now, he says he'll believe us on vaccines, quote, if you show me the science, unquote. Well, he should look at the science, and he should talk to the scientists in this country. Because in the past 50 years alone, vaccines have saved 154 million lives around the world, including the lives of 100 million infants. Vaccines eradicated polio and eradicated smallpox. They've prevented outbreaks of measles where they're used across the great majority of the population. They've kept recent generations from getting chickenpox. And yes, they helped lift the world out of the lockdown from the COVID-19 pandemic. So for generations, America and our federal health agencies have helped fuel this progress. More than 60 years ago, an American said, and I quote, "I hope that the renewed drive to provide vaccination for all Americans, and particularly those who are young, will have the wholehearted support of every parent in America," end of quote. Colleagues, that person was President John F. Kennedy. Unfortunately, his nephew, RFK Jr., has spent decades unraveling that hard-won legacy by spreading lies and conspiracy theories about vaccines. It wasn't that long ago that he spread vaccine conspiracy theories in Samoa, where his misinformation contributed to a measles outbreak that got 83 people killed, mostly infants and children. We cannot let that happen to children here or others around the world. But unfortunately, we're already seeing the costs of that misinformation and those conspiracy theories right here in America. Because that misinformation, the kind of misinformation spread by RFK Jr., has contributed to lower vaccination rates And right now there is a measles outbreak in West Texas that's threatening our children. And it's not the first one we've seen in recent months, and it will not be the last if these conspiracy theories continue to spread. And we know that it doesn't take much misinformation to make us all vulnerable. Because if vaccinations rates drop below 95% in the cases of some diseases, those diseases can spread very rapidly through the population. In fact, for a disease like measles that infects just about everyone exposed, it's disastrous when those vaccination rates fall below 95%. And yet these lies spread by RFK Jr. are now burrowing themselves into the American consciousness like brainworms. And it will be bad enough if he doesn't become Secretary of HHS, given the damage he's already done. But if he becomes Secretary of HHS, he will have a bully pulpit on which those conspiracy theories can spread even further and even farther and put even more Americans at risk. Now, once he was confronted with some of these statements that he had made previously, RFK Jr. started to flip and he started to flop. In fact, at his confirmation hearings, he insisted that he never meant much of what he said, and in fact, he denied having made some statements altogether. He denied making statements that are on tape for everyone to hear them. As we've heard already, in 2013, he compared the CDC's childhood vaccine program to Nazi death camps, saying, and I quote, "To me, this is like Nazi death camps. What happened to these kids?" Unquote. In 2019, he compared the CDC vaccine program to the pedophile scandal in the Catholic Church. In 2023, he said that COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese, end quote. He denied saying that at the hearing. And this and that and flip and flop, he tried to backtrack a confirmation day conversion, nomination day conversion. He also, nevertheless, could not prevent himself, could not help himself from citing a discredited study on vaccines and autism, and repeatedly refused to tell the truth that peer-reviewed studies have shown that vaccines do not cause autism. Madam President, vaccines do not cause autism. So he's not qualified. Worse than that, he poses a danger to the public health, given his conspiracy theories about vaccines. But let's do what he says he does, and let's continue to follow the evidence. Because, Madam President, this nation conducts the best biomedical research in the world. A lot of it comes out of the National Institutes of Health, and I'm proud that they have their home in the state of Maryland. Just last year, the NIH research helped develop an accurate blood test for Alzheimer's, a brain-computer interface to help a man with ALS communicate, and a drug to reduce reactions to peanut allergies. All those things last year at NIH. NIH clinical trials give people hope with novel and hard-to-treat illnesses, including childhood cancer. And yet what we're witnessing in the first 22 days of this Trump administration is an attack on much of that medical research. Right now at the National Institutes of Health, the Trump administration is wreaking havoc. They've frozen internal meetings. They've pulled down information from data sets, from HHS websites. They've denied resources to the public and clinicians. Thankfully, a federal court had to step in and stop their refusal to provide the public with important health information at NIH and CDC. The administration also early on took this illegal action in violation of the Impoundment Control Act to stop a lot of federal grants that had already been appropriated. That also put in jeopardy a lot of NIH research. Again, fortunately, a federal court has intervened and issued a temporary restraining order. But just in the last 3 or 4 days, we had NIH decide to change entirely the formula for reimbursing institutions that study diseases around the country. And the overwhelming evidence and testimony from the experts said that by changing those formulas, they will do great damage to important health research in this country. Again, a federal judge had to intervene to stop this. We shouldn't have to rely on the courts, Madam President.
Mr. President.
The Democratic leader.
Mr. President, this morning, the Senate will vote on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy to serve as Secretary of Health and Human Services. By now, it's beyond clear that Mr. Kennedy is not remotely qualified to become the next Secretary of HHS. In fact, Mr. Kennedy might be one of the least qualified people that Donald Trump could have chosen for the job. There are so many others who would have been better. I'm very proud that every single Democrat will oppose Mr. Kennedy's nomination, because Democrats know better than to elevate a conspiracy theorist to the top healthcare job in the country. I know some of my colleagues feel the same way privately. In fact, if the Senate held a secret ballot today, I'll bet Mr. Kennedy would never come close to becoming confirmed, and that many, if not most, Republicans would vote against him. I think most likely most Republicans would vote against him if there were a secret ballot. But sadly and unfortunately for America, Republicans are being strong-armed by Donald Trump and will end up holding their nose and voting to confirm Mr. Kennedy. What a shame. What a travesty. I urge my Republican colleagues to think very carefully one last time before rolling the dice on Mr. Kennedy. A vote to confirm Mr. Kennedy is a vote to make America sicker. Mr. Kennedy has made a living not by promoting public health, but by actively fighting it. Mr. Kennedy is the face of the modern anti-vaccine movement. Mr. Kennedy has spent decades profiting off vaccine misinformation. Mr. Kennedy told me to my face that he would, quote, defer to the president on issues as personal, as deeply held, as important as abortion. Well, how do we know that Mr. Kennedy won't just defer to the president, who is far from an expert on health care, on other issues and health care issues as well? It's simple. We don't. But if he can change his view and defer to the president on something as deeply held as abortion, the likelihood is he'll change his view on many other health care issues to the detriment of the American people. One thing he won't change his views on is vaccines, I am sure, because he's held that so deeply. My Republican colleagues should think very carefully before voting to elevate a vaccine skeptic, a conspiracy theorist, to oversee our health care system. If confirmed, I fear greatly that Mr. Kennedy will take steps that severely undermine public health, weaken safety standards, and put the needs of for-profit corporations ahead of the needs of American families. And sooner or later, public backlash is going to build, and Republicans will have wished they hadn't signed their names for such a troubled nominee. So one final time, I implore my Republican colleagues to reject the nomination of Kennedy to be Secretary of HHS. A vote to confirm Mr. Kennedy is a vote I truly believe many, many Republicans and most Americans will eventually very deeply regret. Now on costs, lowering costs for average families in the budget resolution. Well, my colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, welcome to the age of Trumpflation. Trumpflation. If there was one mandate that Donald Trump had after winning the election, it was to fight inflation. Remember what he said on the campaign trail? He said, quote, "When I win, I will immediately bring prices down starting on day one." Starting on day one, he said he will bring prices down. Well, today is day 25, and inflation is not down, but actually up by 3%, higher than what economists were expecting. At the grocery store, the price of pork and chicken and beef are all up. Eggs are up 15% from last month. Gas prices are up 2% from last month. Used cars are up. Auto insurance has become more expensive. And what is Donald Trump doing about all this? He's making the problem worse by threatening trade wars with our own allies. Here's what the CEO of Ford Motor Company said yesterday. The CEO of Ford Motor Company warned yesterday that, quote, a 25% tariff across the Mexico and Canadian borders will blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we have never seen. That's the head of Ford Motor. That's not some liberal Democratic economist. The head of Ford Motor says that the tariffs will blow a huge hole in the U.S. auto industry. What he's doing on tariffs is, again, sort of like everything else. It's sort of a meat axe approach, a slash and burn approach, not looking at each individual case and seeing what's good and what's bad. Inflation is the number one issue on people's minds. It was the biggest issue during the election, and already Donald Trump is breaking his promise to do something about it. And the American people are starting to take notice already, even though we're only on day 25 of Trump's term. A recent CBS poll showed that 66% of voters do not think Trump is focused enough on lowering prices. 66% of voters do not think Donald Trump is focused enough on lowering prices. And you know what? They're absolutely right. In the 3 weeks that Donald Trump has been president, he's been focused on pretty much everything but fighting inflation, which is the number one thing people care about. We've seen this maneuver so many times before from Donald Trump. He knows that he has no real answers to fixing inflation. So what does he do? He distracts, he distorts, he says ridiculous and wild, strange things, hoping to distract the country from the fact he's not doing his job. It's why he talks about things like renaming the Gulf of Mexico. It's why he's talking about hotels in Gaza. It's why he's talking about annexing Canada. None of these things have anything to do with the thing that matters most, lowering the cost of living for average American families. And meanwhile, what are the Republicans doing here in Congress? What are my Senate Republican colleagues doing? Are they fighting inflation? Maybe? No way. No way. Republicans are full steam ahead with cutting taxes for the ultra-rich, paid for on the backs of working and middle-class families. Just look at the gargoyle-like budget proposal that the House Republicans released yesterday. Republicans want to make billionaires even wealthier by raising costs for working people. The Republican budget slashes nutrition programs that help 40 million Americans put food on the table. The Republican budget proposes massive cuts to Medicaid, threatening health care for tens of millions of people. It will make food, health care, energy, and housing more expensive, all to cut taxes for the ultra-rich, hurting the middle class, raising costs for the middle class to help the ultra-wealthy. The Republican budget plan can be described in one word: radical. Republicans should remember well what happened the last time they cut taxes for the ultra-wealthy. It backfired with the rest of America. If Republicans try to cut taxes for the ultra-rich again, history is going to repeat itself, and it will cost them dearly at the ballot box. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President,
The senator from Arkansas.
I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that our intern on the Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, Kylie Henneberry, be granted floor privileges through May 9th, 2025, and that CFTC detailee Kevin Webb also be granted floor privileges through the end of the 119th Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm honored to speak on the floor of the Senate and support Brooke Rollins to be Secretary of Agriculture. The Senate will vote on her nomination to this cabinet position today, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. America's farmers, ranchers, foresters need a leader at USDA who will be an advocate for their livelihoods in rural America and be a strong voice to address the pressing needs of our agricultural community. Brooke Rollins is that person. In her hearing before the Senate Agriculture Committee, she pledged to do everything within her ability to ensure that our farmers, ranchers, and rural communities thrive. And we know she will follow through on that because rural America helped shape her into what she is today. She's leading a life of service that began with membership in her small town Texas FFA chapter and continues to credit her FFA advisor for his support and mentorship in her agriculture career. She invited him to attend the nomination hearing before the Senate Agriculture Committee last month, along with the Texas State FFA officer team she served with in high school. Texas Governor Rick Perry knew Brooke Rollins had a heart for Texas farmers and invited her to join his policy team where she advocated for agriculture. She continues that passion today. Her executive leadership during the first Trump administration and her regular collaboration with President Trump make her uniquely qualified to serve in this position and advocate for family farms. She understands the significant responsibility of this role during one of the most economically challenging times for agriculture producers. Hardworking farmers who grow our food are struggling to operate, let alone make a profit in this current economic climate. High inflation and steep input costs far outpacing depressed market prices have put many farm families on a course towards bankruptcy, with multi-generational operations fighting to continue their family legacy. In December, Congress approved natural disaster and emergency assistance to help producers obtain critical operating loans for this crop year. Ensuring delivery of this aid will be one of her first priorities as Secretary. I'm confident she will pursue and produce policies to help rural American live up to its potential. While we first met during the first Trump administration, I've had the opportunity to get to know her better during her confirmation process, and she has demonstrated her enthusiasm for being a voice for small-town American and agriculture producers. I'm grateful she is willing to take on this big responsibility and willing to be part of the solution to help rural America at this time of unprecedented challenges. As chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, I've met with farmers, ranchers, and agricultural stakeholders from all over the country, and they have been sounding the alarm of the dire circumstances they face in producing a safe, affordable, and abundant supply of food. Farmers from my home state of Arkansas shared with the committee last week about the difficult conversations they are forced to have right now about continuing their multi-generational farms and risking their family's future in the industry. Unfortunately, this is a conversation many more farm families across the country will have if we do not act quickly. Congress must deliver an updated 5-year farm bill that modernizes the safety net in order to maximize liabilities in order to minimize the liabilities farm families take on when they plant their crops. Food security is national security. Our country is blessed to have grocery stores stocked with food to put on our tables. This is the result of the hard work of our farmers and ranchers. These producers need the tools to be successful and continue to grow the food, fiber, and fuel our nation depends on. I know Brooke Rollins shares my commitment to enhancing the policies that help farm families and rural communities thrive. Given her executive leadership, she is well prepared to hit the ground running, and she walks through the doors of USDA's secretary and deliver the certainty and predictability our producers need. I look forward to working with her to strengthen rural America and the men, women, and families who call it home. I also want to thank everyone on both sides of the aisle in making it such that we could do this in such a expeditious way. It took a lot of cooperation. I think it just shows how important our farmers are to both Democrats and Republicans. It's one of the few areas that's not a partisan issue. It's all about helping the men and women that work so very hard to provide the food that we need. So with that, I yield back.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, anybody who knows me well knows that I say this a lot, and that is that agriculture is the lifeblood of South Dakota and the lifeblood of our country. And farmers and ranchers are hard at work every single day to feed America and the world. But what I hear lately from farmers and ranchers is not good. Agricultural producers across the country have faced strong headwinds in recent years. Higher input costs, high interest rates, lower commodity prices, all leading to declining farm income year after year. Natural disasters have struck many of our farm regions, and the bird flu continues to ravage agriculture across the country. Of course, the last few years, the Biden administration was hardly much help. It imposed burdensome regulations like WOTUS, or Waters of the United States, that threatened to devastate the farm sector. The administration put expanding market access on the back burner while our agricultural trade deficit grew to record levels. And their profligate spending led to inflation that hit farmers and ranchers especially hard in the form of higher input costs. Meanwhile, Democrats here in Congress failed to prioritize a modernized farm bill to support agriculture through these challenges. And we are now more than a year past due for an updated farm bill. Mr. President, American farmers and ranchers deserve better.
much better. And I expect things will be different under President Trump. I know that farmers and ranchers will have a friend in Brooke Rollins, the President's choice for Secretary of Agriculture. Mrs. Rollins grew up in the small agricultural town of Glen Rose, Texas. She spent summers working for her family on their farm in Minnesota, helping with their corn, potato, and soybean crops. She was a 4-H'er, an FFA state officer, and a barrel racer. And her 4 kids are keeping up the family's way of life showing cattle in Texas. After studying agriculture development at Texas A&M, Mrs. Rollins went to work for then Governor Rick Perry, where she worked on agricultural policy. She then continued her ag work by building up a Texas think tank empowering the voices of farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. Then she served in President Trump's first administration, first leading the Office of American Innovation, and then the Domestic Policy Council. This President, Brooke Rollins, is a policy wonk with a farmer's heart. She understands the needs of agriculture producers, and she knows how to deliver results. And she promises to get right to work after she is confirmed on 4 key priorities. First, getting disaster and economic aid out the door and into the hands of farmers. Second, getting the bird flu and other animal disease outbreaks under control. Third, getting the Farm Bill done. And finally, revitalizing the U.S. Department of Agriculture to focus on its core mission and put America and American agriculture first. Mr. President, I'm looking forward to working with Mrs. Rollins on these key priorities. Under this Republican majority, delivering a modernized Farm Bill is a priority. And I'm glad that Mrs. Rollins has pledged to work with Congress on one of the top Farm Bill needs, which is strengthening the farm safety net, which is essential to keeping existing operations going and encouraging the next generation of producers to get started. I was also pleased to hear Mrs. Rollins acknowledge the need to improve management of national forests. The Black Hills National Forest, among others across the country, has seen its timber industry decimated by bad management policies. So I look forward to working with USDA under Secretary Rollins to provide relief from the dire situation in western South Dakota. And I'm encouraged as well that she will prioritize getting disaster and economic assistance out the door. Last year, many parts of the country suffered from natural disasters, including South Dakota. And as I said, farmers and ranchers have suffered lower commodity prices and declining incomes. In December, Congress passed $31 billion in agricultural disaster and economic assistance. And we need to get that money into the hands of farmers and ranchers working to rebuild. Mr. President, Brooke Rollins understands the mission of USDA. She understands the day-to-day needs of America's farmers, and she has the expertise to deliver results. I trust that she will put America's farmers and ranchers first as Secretary of Agriculture, and I look forward to working with her in this role. Mr. President, later today I will introduce a bill to repeal the death tax. As I mentioned, as a resident of a rural state filled with family farms and ranches, I have made death tax repeal a priority for a long time. And I was proud to help secure a doubling of the death tax exemption in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This doubled exemption has provided certainty to a lot of farms and ranches and small businesses over the past 7 years. But the expanded exemption is expiring at the end of this year. And it's my hope that we will not merely extend this exemption, but that we will get rid of this fundamentally flawed tax once and for all. Mr. President, the death tax is fundamentally flawed both in theory and in practice. There should be a limit to how many times the government can tax you. The money you have leave at your death has already been taxed by the government at least once, which makes the death tax double taxation. And the government isn't even profiting all that much from this double taxation. That's right, the death tax accounts for a teeny tiny fraction of government revenue. In fact, there's reason to believe that the government would collect more in taxes if it got rid of the death tax entirely, due to the economic growth and job creation that would stem from its elimination. So how is there any support left for this burdensome tax? Well, Mr. President, that's a good question. For some, of course, heavy taxation is axiomatic. Do well, their thinking runs, and the government should come after you. Some think that you shouldn't be able to pass the results of hard work down to your children upon your death. Well, Mr. President, death tax proponents tend to talk as if the death tax only affects the extremely wealthy. But nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. The death tax can sweep up those who have very little in the bank, notably family farms and ranches and family businesses. How? Well, farming and ranching is often a cash-poor business. A farmer might have substantial-looking assets on paper, but the vast majority of that is land and farming equipment. Only a small fraction of it is money in the bank. On top of that, farmland can often be valued at a level that is inconsistent with its agricultural productivity value. A farmer might have land with a substantial value on paper, but the crop yield on that land could be worth far, far less. So what happens when a farmer or rancher dies and his estate is subject to the tax? There's a very good chance that his liquid assets, in other words, the cash that he has available in the bank, won't come close to covering the tax bill from the federal government. And the only alternative for his heirs may be to start selling off land or farm equipment to pay the tax. In some cases, they will be able to keep the farm, just a smaller version of it. In others, they may have to sell off the family farm entirely. The case is similar with family-owned businesses. The owner might appear to have substantial-looking assets on paper, but only a small fraction of that may be money in the bank. The vast majority may be tied up in the business. And once again, when the federal government comes around demanding a huge portion of this individual's taxable estate, there may not be anywhere close to enough money in the bank to pay the tax. To pay the federal government, the owner's descendants will have to sell off part or all of the family business. Now, Mr. President, family farms and ranches are the lifeblood of rural communities in South Dakota. They're a source of jobs. They provide support for local businesses. They help build up local schools and local infrastructure. Losing a local farm can hit rural communities very, very hard, especially when that farm or ranch is bought up by an out-of-state business with few ties to the community and limited interest in building it up. And Mr. President, it's not just those who actually get hit by the estate tax who suffer. A lot of family farms and ranches and family businesses spend a lot of time and money on estate planning to avoid being hit by this tax. That's time and money that could have gone into building their business, investing in new equipment, hiring new workers, and the list goes on. Some set aside capital to prepare for the death tax, capital that, again, could go into building up the farm or ranch or hiring new workers for the family business. As one of my Democrat colleagues, the senior senator from Washington, said a while back, and I quote, "The estate tax is bad for businesses, it is bad for workers and new job creation, and it is bad for our communities who are watching their local family-owned businesses get swallowed up by large corporations," end quote. Well, Mr. President, as I said, we protected a lot more family farms and family businesses by doubling the death tax exemption in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017. But we didn't protect them all. And those we did protect will lose those protections at the end of this year. It is time to end this punishing and burdensome tax once and for all. I want to thank my Republican colleagues who have joined me in sponsoring this legislation. And Mr. President, I hope that 2025 will be the year that we permanently bid farewell to the death tax. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 15 minutes, Senator Crapo for up to 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 2 minutes prior to the scheduled votes.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, late into the night, senators spoke on the Senate floor about why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the least qualified nominee to ever be tapped as America's chief health officer. On issue after issue, Mr. Kennedy has demonstrated a profound lack of knowledge at best and deeply dangerous views at worst. Mr. Kennedy has refused to tell Americans how he would manage health care issues that they're deeply worried about: vaccine safety, women's reproductive health, drug pricing, and affordable health care, to name a few. This leaves, Mr. President, millions of Americans alarmed about the future of health and science in America. Last week, 2 Oregon medical students approached me to talk about Mr. Kennedy's nomination. These medical students told me they were less concerned about the damage Mr. Kennedy would do as HHS Secretary in the weeks and months to come. These medical students are not only worried about the prospect of losing cures, treatments, and medical breakthroughs if Mr. Kennedy is confirmed. These medical students from Oregon told me that his unwillingness to take science and medical data seriously is going to harm science for decades to come. So I ask my colleagues to think about those medical students' words. Is that a legacy you want to leave behind as a result of supporting Mr. Kennedy? Senate Democrats have been making this exact case. In his hearing before the Finance Committee, I asked Mr. Kennedy to square his anti-vaccine views with more recent statements designed to appease a number of our senators who are quite nervous about his nomination. In his testimony, he used the fact that his own children were vaccinated to prove he was not anti-vaccine. But the record shows that just a few years ago, he said he would, quote, do anything and pay anything to go back in time in order to prevent them from getting those vaccines. Elsewhere in his testimony, Mr. Kennedy stated he was not anti-vaccine, but rather pro-safety. But about 18 months ago, he said on a podcast, and I quote, no vaccine is safe and effective. In other words, Mr. President, in the Senate Finance Committee, we brought the evidence, we brought the receipts, and Mr. Kennedy said nothing to actually disavow his prior statements. He stuck by the time-worn tactics of a conspiracy theorist. Always ask for more evidence and never accept the evidence that's placed in front of you. Even some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are now deeply disturbed by Mr. Kennedy's refusal to entertain evidence that would require him to change his mind on vaccine safety. Nevertheless, it sure looks like my Republican colleagues have bowed to pressure from Donald Trump and are poised to hand Mr. Kennedy the platform he has been seeking for 2 decades to push fringe views. So before the Senate votes, I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about the fights ahead on health care. Republicans in the House are already pressing ahead this morning with their plan to kick millions of Americans off of their health insurance in order to fund more tax cuts for those who are very wealthy. And as HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy is going to be a key player in this effort. While senators were on the floor speaking yesterday, the Senate Budget Committee debated a budget resolution that unlocks the legislative tools Republicans need to make good on their go-it-alone plan. At the same time, the House Budget Committee released its own budget resolution that will be debated today. Mr. President, what is clear in both of these blueprints, in their game plan, is that Medicaid cuts are at the top of the list. 81 million Americans rely on health care coverage under Medicaid, and the CHIP program for kids. Those people are folks with disabilities, low-income families, seniors, and of course children. The damage and destruction to American families if Republicans go through with their plans to gut Medicaid cannot be overstated. Take nursing homes, for example. 2 out of 3 nursing home residents are currently being covered for their health care by Medicaid. Imagine you visit your mom in her nursing home in the months after the Republican bill makes steep cuts to Medicaid. Your mom complains there are fewer and fewer staff. She had to wait more than an hour after calling for help to use the bathroom on several occasions. Next time you visit, she tells you some of the new staff don't have time for her. You learn that the facility no longer has the resources to conduct background checks and that they're desperate for workers. A few weeks later, the facility manager pulls you aside to deliver some bad news. Her nursing home can no longer accept patients with Medicaid after steep federal cuts to the program. Unless you can find another facility that accepts Medicaid, you've got to pay the high monthly cost out of your own pocket. Suddenly, and with no warning, you've got impossible options. Either you scramble to find the money to cover a new facility that costs thousands of dollars a month, or you bring your mom home with you. So between holding down a full-time job and raising young kids, suddenly you have to deal with making sure that your mom gets full-time care, and that requires nursing assistance around the clock. Unfortunately, this case is something you see in every Republicans will regret any decision they give, any vote they give to Robert Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy will no doubt be right alongside Republicans, a willing participant in this future for health care that I've described today that is really stepping back from progress that has been made. I urge a no vote, colleagues, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in support of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s nomination to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of his confirmation. Contrary to the attacks that have constantly been made on him, he has made it very clear that he will support safe vaccinations and just wants to see that the research on them is done and done well. When his nomination for the role of Secretary of HHS was announced, Mr. Kennedy stated, "We have a generational opportunity to bring together the greatest minds in science, medicine, industry, and government to put an end to the chronic disease epidemic facing Americans." I agree with him. We've got to get into the business of making America healthy again. Mr. Kennedy's dedication to this commitment has been apparent throughout the nomination process. He will bring a fresh perspective to health care, prioritizing consumer choice, information transparency, and early interventions to strengthen the well-being of all Americans. He has been responsive to a wide variety of questions from members on both sides of the aisle, appearing before 2 committees and answering hundreds of questions for the record, not to mention going through the extensive vetting process of the Finance Committee, which I chair, which is the most extensive vetting process that any candidate in the Senate goes through, for a position in this administration goes through in the Senate. While some of my colleagues continue to question his financial agreements, Mr. Kennedy met and then exceeded the requirements set forth by the Office of Government Ethics. Mr. Kennedy has participated in one of the most extensive processes, as I've said, that our Senate puts a nominee through, and has succeeded in meeting those standards. And I encourage my colleagues to support his nomination. Now, before I close, I want to respond briefly to the comments that we've heard today here on the floor and all day yesterday in a long Budget Committee hearing to set up the first reconciliation legislation to come before the Congress. It was said today that Republicans are going to take Medicaid away from children. They are going to take health care away from seniors. It was said yesterday that we were going to go after pretty much old people, young people, middle-aged people, and every other kind of people, because we are going to destroy the support base that they have here in the federal system. The fact is, this is the politics of fear, the politics of claiming things that are going to happen which are not going to happen. The reality is that yesterday's Budget Committee meeting was not on health care. There was nothing done in the meeting yesterday that would have done any of the things that you've heard on the floor today. What we did do yesterday was to set up a process so we can provide some significant extra spending authority to our government to close the border and deport the violent criminals who have come into our country in the millions in the last few years. We had another provision in it to give significant new resources to our national defense so that we can build back our Department of Defense and the authority of those in our armed services, the ability of those of our armed services members to have the technology and the equipment and be capable of responding to threats to our nation. And finally, we restarted and charged up our use and engagement in producing America's energy in America so that we can get back into the business of being independent and not relying on other nations for our energy policy. Those are the 3 things that we focused on in the committee yesterday. And by the way, each one of those was a little bit costly, and every one of those was offset so that there was no increase in federal spending. Mr. President, I think we need to argue over facts when we get into these debates. We're going to have a tremendous number of debates. And yes, we will debate on health care at some point. But yesterday, and what we did yesterday, was focused on the border, on national defense, and on reboosting our energy production in America. I encourage a strong yes vote for Robert F. Kennedy to be the next Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I would ask unanimous consent for 1 minute for an opportunity to respond to my colleague from Idaho.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would only say to my friend from Idaho that he says this is not going to happen, that people are going to be safe and seniors on Medicaid and the like will be safe. I would just say to my colleague, it starts today. Today, in the other body of Congress, I'd say to my colleague, the process of setting in motion these cuts to essential health care services begins today. We can read about it in the publications about the congressional schedule. I look forward to working with my colleague when we can find common ground. But on this point that it's not going to happen, everybody's going to be safe, the efforts to cut these vital programs, including Medicaid, begins this morning in the other body, and I yield the floor.
Could I have 30 seconds to just respond? I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would simply say that we hear this every time we look at trying to address the spending excesses in our government. And I will just say to my colleague and to everyone, we're not going to take health care away from children. We're not going to take health care away from adults, from seniors, or middle-aged people. We are not going to attack the benefits that people get under Medicare. And frankly, we will reform some of the spending, yes, but we will not do all of the terrible things that are being spun up to try to attack this effort to control the excessive spending in our government.
Democrat leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the fact that we're here right now, that we're even here right now, voting on this wildly unqualified conspiracy theorist to trust with one of the most life or death jobs, HHS Secretary, charged with protecting the health of every single American, should be an affront to every senator and the millions of Americans that will be impacted by this horrific nomination. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I implore you, think one last time about this vote. My colleagues on the Republican side, you know the consequences of what you're doing. My colleagues on the Republican side, you know how dangerous this is. My colleagues on the other side, you know you are not putting your constituents, their health, their families first when you vote yes. To quote my colleague, the junior senator from Texas, just a few years ago, he said, quote, "We need an expert. We need a scientist. We need someone who knows something about health care heading the Health and Human Services Department." Well, which is Robert Kennedy? An expert? A scientist? Or what about the senior senator from Louisiana, the chair of the Health Committee, and a well-respected medical professional himself? A few years ago, here's what he said. Previous HHS secretaries have had a pharmaceutical industry background, have been a state health commissioner, have run health systems, have been governors. Somebody who has had a background in actually administering the programs that HHS administers. I ask my colleagues, which of these qualifications does RFK possess? You know the answer, none of them. The question in front of this body today, the question in front of this body is not simply to confirm RFK to run the nation's health department. The question before us is, Very simple. Which is more important to you? The health and well-being of your constituents, or blindly obeying orders, knowing full well the dangerous impacts your vote will enable? I plead with you one more time, rethink this issue. This is dangerous. This is wrong. Very wrong. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. The question occurs on the Kennedy nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Brand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, thank you, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bozeman, Cornyn, Crapo, Graham, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, and Tuberville. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Gallego, Lujan, Markey, Schumer, and Wyden. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. McCormick, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Ms. Collins, aye. I did, thank you. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Schatz? No. Ms. Smith? No. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Lemus? Aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Kim, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Fisher, aye. Ms. Slotkin? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Paul, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52, the nays are 48. The confirmation is confirmed. Just number 4? Yeah, but just number 4. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the cloture motion with respect to the Rollins nomination is withdrawn. The clerk will report the Rollins nomination.
Department of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins of Texas to be Secretary.
The question occurs on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Mr. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters,
Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Capito, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Fisher, Gallego, Hickenlooper, Hyde-Smith, Justice, Kennedy, Klobuchar, Langford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Rosen, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Sheehy, Slotkin, Welch. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Blumenthal, Hirono, Kim, King, Lujan, Padilla, Smith, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Ms. Markowski, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Schatz, no.
Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed.